Está a ver? Eu sou cumprir ordens. Nem quero xingar. Já está, não tenho ela estava esquecendo de pôr a carregar
Problems identified by the 169 targets. This is our main goal. Well, as for the topic that brings us here today, we would like to stress a few things. What we see today is that there is a demand for companies to work within their supply chains, because your responsibility does not end at the border of your company. So you have to work with your suppliers, and you have to understand what kind of issues and what kind of problems may arise from your suppliers regarding human rights, business integrity, environmental protection, or others. And what we see at the moment is that there is a need to level the playing field internationally. So there are a lot of guidance, voluntary standards, and of course, more recently, directives that are coming to level that playing field, making companies work with their suppliers internationally on these key topics. That's what we see at the moment. And just to give you, a global landscape of what's happening across borders. Of course, I'm not going to look at this, but just to show you that there are several initiatives, most of them regarding legislation, local legislation from different countries. But of course, what we see is that this is not, it's not happening everywhere. We have different initiatives in different parts of the world. But the most demanding ones, the ones that have more requirements, are related to the European Union. And what we see is that this influences the way that companies behave and the way they have to manage their operations across borders. Our key topic is human rights, because we are a UN initiative, so of course that's what we have to work on mainly. But just to give you an example of all the legislative initiatives that are happening from the Green Deal perspective, and most of them are related to human rights also. Okay, so we have a lot of drivers to work on human rights. But what we see even today is that most companies, or several companies, do not understand why they have to work on human rights. Some of them understand it, but they don't know how to address it, because they feel it's not their responsibility, but the state's responsibility. So there was a major contribution from John Rusey. He's not among us anymore, but he was a quite important figure related to all the legislation and all the guidance that we have on business and human rights. And what he says is, you have to show, you have to have evidence that you are addressing human rights the proper way. So it was quite important on this topic for us, and he created the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that I will show you through a video, which is easier than explaining. Let's see if we can see it. Yeah.
Businesses impact human rights wherever and however they operate. These impacts can be positive, or they can be negative. These days, companies are global, and that means their impacts are too. Companies operate in poor countries and post-conflict countries, in countries where the local government is unable or unwilling to enforce its own laws. With all this complexity, it's not always clear who's responsible for preventing companies from violating human rights. Is it the company's fault for paying less than a living wage? Or is it the government's fault for setting the minimum wage below the poverty line? Victims of corporate human rights abuses find themselves trapped between two actors who have no interest in making things right. In 2011, the United Nations issued a set of principles that define the responsibilities of governments and businesses for solving this dilemma. So what do these principles say? There's 3 pillars. The first says that governments have to make sure that businesses don't violate anyone's human rights. That means passing laws that prevent human rights violations, but also making sure these laws are implemented. Some of the world's largest multinational corporations are owned and operated by states. The guiding principles say that governments have to prevent human rights violations by businesses, even if the state itself is acting like one. The second pillar says that businesses have to refrain from violating human rights wherever and however they do business. That means it's not enough for companies to simply follow the law where they operate, or to audit a few of their suppliers. Even in countries where the government doesn't take up its own duty, companies have to know their human rights impacts and take concrete steps to improve them. The guiding principles don't offer any loopholes. Companies are responsible for all human rights. Doing things like building a school or digging a well doesn't get them out of their basic responsibility not to make their workers and communities worse off. Companies have to perform human rights due diligence. That means talking to the people whose lives they might be affecting. Like the government responsibility, respecting human rights isn't a switch that companies can turn on and off. It's a continuous process. The third pillar of the guiding principles is about what happens when something goes wrong. If a company abuses human rights, governments have to make sure that the court system or some other legitimate process allows the victims to file a complaint and that that complaint is investigated and settled. Companies have this obligation too. Part of human rights due diligence is allowing people affected by the company to file grievances and participating in processes to make them right. Whatever route they choose, remedy mechanisms should fit with the effectiveness criteria defined by the guiding principles. If the complaint system is slow, or it costs too much money, or it's far away, it doesn't count. So that's what the guiding principles on business and human rights say. So why are they important? First, the principles were unanimously approved by the UN Human Rights Council. Since then, they've been endorsed by governments and business actors all over the world. Before, we argued over who was responsible for preventing human rights abuses by companies. Thanks to the UN Guiding Principles, we know who's responsible. That means that instead of arguing over the rules, we can get to work implementing them.
This was quite important just to understand that there is a state's responsibility, but there is companies' responsibility. And we have companies that are on the first stage, or countries that are on the first stage, but we also have countries and companies, large ones, that are already looking and implementing the OECD due diligence guidance. And now at the moment we are currently going for the corporate sustainability due diligence directive. So this is a kind of maturity level playing field, so companies have to look at this very closely. Well, the directive, of course, is a European framework, so it applies mainly to European companies, but also for those companies that want to operate in Europe. So, and even it is targeted to large companies with more than 1,000 employees and 450 million euros of revenue. The question is that it also affects different SMEs because they belong to the value chains of these companies. So they will have to show certain practices and procedures if they want to continue to operate with these large companies. And the main goal is, of course, to address human rights concerns and, of course, environmental concerns in supply chains. So when we talk about addressing human rights, we are talking about key stakeholders that we have to look at. The company's workers, supply chain workers, communities, and end users of the materials or the products that our company works with. So this is the purpose of the corporate directive, the Triple D. And just to finish, there are some key requirements. The first one is just to identify which are the projects, the partners, or the activities where we can have some kind of human rights issues or key topics, or environmental ones, of course. Then we have to assess the risks that we can identify and try to mitigate them through company policies, procedures, working with suppliers, creating awareness, contract requirements, or other instruments. And then, of course, we have to have a way of monitoring what's happening within the supply chain. So this is all about performance, because what we want to do is just to mitigate those risks that come from supply chains. Okay, so maybe now with this kind of introduction, we can give the floor to Salome, which is going to talk with some companies, and they will showcase what they are doing with supply chains. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Annabella. So following this keynote presentation, we'll now move on to a panel discussion. And now let me introduce to Maria Susana Carvalho, Head of Sustainability and Climate Transition at Bondalti, Rodrigo Fernandes, Director, ESDG at Bentley Systems, João Pedro Pereira, Head of Strategy, M&A and Sustainability at MCA, and João Mestre, Head of Sustainability at Fidelidade. Moderating this panel today is Salome Zurabishvili, Executive Director at UN Global Compact Network, Georgia.
All set now, right? Thank you so much to the UN Global Compact Network Portugal for organizing this very important discussion. I would like to really highlight the importance of discussing the human rights due diligence at COP29, because the climate change affects the human rights of the population, especially when we talk about the multinational companies operate in different countries and contexts and geographies where there are communities in the vulnerable situations. So it becomes even more important for those companies to incorporate the proper due diligence mechanisms within their supply chain and assess what are the risks at the ground and how they can actually effectively address those risks, and also put in place proper grievance mechanisms in case the human rights are violated. So we will have the possibility to dive into the discussions. Thank you so much to the panelists for participating today. And my first question to all of you would be, first of all, to set the context, what are the context, the countries that you are operating in, what is your supply chain, how do you put in place a proper due diligence processes in your supply chain, and also the most important thing, what are the challenges that you face? Because we tend to not talk about the challenges most of the time, just talking about the good practice, but I think actually speaking about the challenges is the most important thing now at COP29 to then take steps to solve those challenges. So I would like to start with Maria. So you're coming from the energy sector. What is your supply chain? Can you tell us more about it, and what are the challenges that you face in terms of the human rights?
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you once again for Global Compact Network Portugal for this invitation to be here. So I work for Bondalti. In Portugal is the largest chemical industry in Portugal, one of the largest in Iberia, Portugal and Spain. So we provide both organic and inorganic products. We have a large supply chain. So even considering raw materials and also transporters, transportation systems, and also our clients, which are spread all over the world. But concerning our suppliers, we have a lot of suppliers based in Europe, some of them in Turkey, Canada, United States, Japan inclusively. But our main concern is that these suppliers represent our Tier 1 suppliers, and we have to focus on Tier 2 and 3 also. So we have been developing, we started developing actually this year, we decided last year and started this year, implementing a program, a global strategy for engagement in the supply chain. That includes a major digital platform with a partner in Iberia that accesses and connects directly to each of these suppliers, providing data and intelligence from these suppliers to monitor an ESG radar. So this ESG radar has more than 600 questions to evaluate each of these suppliers and inclusively their own subcontractors and supply chain. And some of the human rights topics cover all of the principles from the Global Compact, like child labor, forced labor, slavery, anti-corruption, bribery, etc. And our main challenge is firstly to get access to data, because some of these suppliers don't have it exhaustively documented. And the second concern is that we cannot rely only on documental evidence or in remote interviews. With most of them, especially outside of Europe, we have to conduct on-site audits and to be there and connect directly to the workers on site to be able to understand what the issues might be there.
Would you say that it's a problem of the lack of awareness, or they just don't want to provide this data? And if it's the first one, what do you do in order to build the capacities? Because in most of the cases, when you work with the suppliers, the capacity building is a very important issue for them to provide the data that you want to further on get to also use it in your reporting processes and in your due diligence process.
Sure. I think it's multiple reasons. So lack of capacity is one of them. Also, some fear of reprisals that might happen also. So, for instance, for workers, and this concerns mainly our sites in Europe, workers inside of our sites that represent our workforce that don't report directly to our company but work together with our teams, inclusively in Europe, there can be some issues. So we are very close to these people, and we incentivize our own teams to connect and to have a human connection with these people, because sometimes they don't have the capacity to understand the laws that are applicable to their own workforce. Sometimes they aren't aware. And our teams might identify closely these kind of issues, and we have reported them. And we work directly with the supplier to understand if it was punctual, if it is systemic, and how to move forward and to solve these problems. And we can take it up to major consequences if necessary to exclude that supplier is.
Thank you so much, Maria. Very, very important practice that you have shared with us. Now, moving from the energy sector to the software industry. Rodrigo, thank you so much for being with us today. So my question to you would be specifically in terms of with the companies that you work with. So you provide the software systems to the companies and help them to be more responsible. How do you help them to be responsible in terms of the human rights perspective as well? And what are the challenges that you face when you are working with them to help them to set up a proper due diligence processes as well?
Right. Thank you for this. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. So let me just step back a bit. So I have a kind of uncommon position. So I'm director of ESDG, of Bentley Systems, which is Empowering Sustainable Development Goals. Basically, I'm focused on the positive impact, the handprint that we can and we should generate as being from a company that is providing software for engineers, designing, building, operating all kinds of infrastructure you have in the world. So Bentley Systems is not the car company. We don't sell cars. We sell software. So there's no connection with Bentley Motors, which is another nothing to do with us. Okay. So it's just to take the elephant in the room for this. But so our supply chain is relatively small, just to say. So we are in 194 countries with more than 5,000 people working around the world. We promote a lot of working from home. So for us, it's, providing software for infrastructure. Infrastructure is responsible for almost 80% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So it covers many aspects of what we are talking here about human rights and not only. And the fact that we have this responsibility, providing software for engineers to do this, it's very important for us. But we also have our challenges, right? By operating in all these countries, we have different diverse jurisdictional regimes, and so we need to handle that. We also have our own supply code of conduct. We also have internal, training all years for all workers, which is mandatory for everyone to do, so they can understand all the aspects of human rights, and not only about environmental aspects, bribery, corruption. We need to be aware of all these. It's part of our compliance system, right? In terms of so another challenge we have, and it's also from a software development company, it's also we rely much on cloud services. So all the services we provide are mostly connected to what we call the infrastructure digital twins, which are cloud-based that we provide. So we rely on our, Microsoft and Google are our main partners for us, and we work with them, and we try to handle this. But of course, there's this aspect of AI, which we are bringing more and more as part of our solutions, and putting more pressure on resources, like for instance, talking about water and the human rights. The human right of water, having access to water is very important. But if you put a data center in a location where there's water scarcity because of climate change or not, then you might generate problems, because to cool those data centers you need water, and you create a competition between water supply for citizens and water supply for cooling services. So that's also something that needs to be addressed somehow. But then, I think we can, in the next questions, we can talk more about some of the positive impacts that we believe that we can help others in energy transition, in health, food, with farming and water as well, right? So those are some of the aspects that we cover. Yeah.
So just a very quick follow-up question. Maria talked about some due diligence process where they also go to the companies on the ground and do audit and check the operations on the ground. You talked about the capacity building. Do you also have the auditing mechanisms to check your supply chain, and how do you do it? Just to provide it very short.
As I told you, the supply chain, we cannot compare from a software development company the supply chain from Bondalti with Bentley. Our supply chain is very, very small and short, right? We use hardware and software, and in terms of that, we have our the statement against modern bribery and human trafficking and all that. So we don't have this kind of audit right now, because it's not part of our business, right? So it's the internal operations we have. It's mostly relying on cloud services, and what we try to do is to follow and work really strongly with Microsoft, which is our first option for cloud. We rely strongly. It's like 95% of our cloud services are depending on Microsoft's performance, honestly, and that's really what makes the difference for us. So really, many of our, the aspects that we cover, it's more, from an industry perspective, how the positive impacts of what we provide for human rights, it's way more relevant for the value chain than us, right? In terms of software, we are in the
Of course,
another part.
from the different sector to sector,
it's very
the
different.
practices of course differ. And very interesting to hear all the policies that you put in place and the capacity building that you do and how you work with your contractors, and especially with Microsoft, who is doing itself quite a good job of working with the supply chains in order to ensure the due diligence process. But thank you so much for sharing your experience. I will go to Joao. Thank you so much for being with us. And going back to the energy sector, how you ensure, what is your examples of putting in place proper due diligence processes for the supply chain sustainability, and especially the human rights protection, and also kind of an overview where you operate.
Thank you. Thank you, UN Global Compact, for the invite. So MCA, we are a project development company, and we operate across different sectors, ranging from, as you said, the renewable energy space, but also in urban development, infrastructures, and also some healthcare assets. So this involves obviously quite a large supply chain, especially since we operate also in different geographies. Not only in Iberia, so in Portugal and Spain, also in Central Europe and in Africa, notably in Angola, where most of our growth is coming from today. So we work in different sectors, which means having a supply chain which has to source products and materials from different regions in the world, and this brings some complexities. So the way we see the human rights process in terms of supply chain integrity, I would divide it into three parts. So firstly, we have to basically negatively screen some of our suppliers. So this involves using compliance tools such as looking at adverse media or judicial processes in the suppliers and partners which we are sourcing or potentially sourcing. And if we do identify
I think there is a problem. Maybe, you can use mine.
Thank you. So, as I was saying, we have to look at the risks that are identified in that process, and if we do see any significant risks, then we have to be brave enough to exclude these partners from our procurement process. So this on the one hand. Then on the second hand, what we do is advocacy, so basically internal and external advocacy, which basically means working with our own teams, not only within the compliance department, but also across business units, across the procurement team, to ensure that they are trained to understand the risks of ensuring supply chain integrity. And in terms of contracting, so we ensure that there are clauses in our contracts which allude to our code of ethics and conduct, which ensure that our partners and suppliers are aligned with MCA's values and the way we want to act, not only within our team but also with the outside world. And something that was already referenced here, which basically assumes that we can conduct audits if needed, both on site on our operations, but if necessary also on suppliers' premises, to understand if they are respecting human rights also within their production facilities, independently of where in the world they are. We obviously take international laws very seriously, so not only in terms of the national laws where we are operating, but also in terms of International Labour Organization laws and as part of the UN Global Compact, we also subscribe to the 10 principles, and so we want to ensure that our partners are also aligned with these principles.
So my question would be back to the challenges. So you do assess the adverse human rights impacts, you identify the salient human rights, and then you act like you put the policies in place, proper due diligence, do audits. But what are the challenges on the ground that you encountered, like to bring just one example, and how you dealt with this challenge?
So I think one of the challenge is clearly the fact that we supply products from various different parts of the world. So one thing is being based in Portugal and performing audits in our suppliers which are based in Portugal. If we are executing a project in Angola, then we have a very large team in Angola which are perfectly capable of also understanding the risks involved in the operations in those countries. But as an example, we source solar panels all the way from South Korea, which is more challenging to understand their business context, how they treat their workers. What we do is through advocacy and through trying to understand which kind of suppliers we can and which kind of suppliers we should not be working with, based on information, public information that is available, and only very occasionally would we actually perform an audit on site, given the geographical challenges.
Thank you so much. Very interesting information that you shared and how you operate across the regions. It's really fascinating, like Africa, Europe, Asia. So it's very important to keep track of what are the local contexts, the legislations, what is the market, and you're doing a great job in that. Thank you so much. And we're moving to the insurance sector. Joao, thank you so much for being with us. Can you share with us what are the challenges in the insurance sector in terms of the due diligence in the supply chains, and how you put in place effective policies and mechanisms to ensure human rights protection?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation from Global Compact. Well, just to give a brief overview, Fidelidade is an insurance company, as you said, present across 13 countries in 4 continents. So we are present in Europe, Portugal, Spain, and France, Liechtenstein. But then we have operations in countries such as Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, Chile. So we have a very diverse reality across these geographies. And being an insurance company, and a little bit similar to Bentley, our responsibility is mainly on paying for the claims that our clients have. So sometimes we don't have so much information on the suppliers that are behind and that are basically being used to pay these claims. Depends a lot on the business line that we are discussing. And then also depending on the business line we may be facing, for example, hospitals and clinics that have huge regulation and they don't have, for example, child labor for sure. But then we have other types of suppliers that may be on the construction side or that might have some human rights issues, especially in some of the countries that we are in. So it's a very diverse reality. And coming to respond to your concrete question of challenges, I think there are a lot. First of all, I think I need to be honest, we don't do everything right, for sure. And we are fully aware of that, but we want to. So what we started by the normal things, as the other panelists already mentioned. We have a procurement policy, a code of conduct for suppliers. We are doing training for our own employees. We need to start internally first to engage and for them to understand why are we worried about these topics, because it's not firstly, it's not obvious that we need to be aware of as it was shown before. It's the responsibility of the governments so people firstly think about that, and they don't understand why are we worried about this type of things. then we divide our suppliers in actually two parts. One is normal suppliers such as Microsoft or EDP for energy, so all these type of for our own headquarters. But then we have we call it partners. So this type of, as I said, hospitals, clinics, pet clinics, trailers to when you have a car accident. So these are all partners. Even our own commercial network, there is a huge partner for ours, our agents. So we started with actually our agents to do some training, not only on human rights, but ESG as a whole. And we are feeling that is probably one of the best ways to move forward, because in some of our partners, we may be responsible for 80-90% of their revenues. So it's our responsibility to make sure that they not only imposing them some rules, but also supporting them, because the other challenge is for people internally and externally, understanding that this is not, why is this important, and bringing the business angle on this. It's a huge potential risk for a company to be exposed to this type of risks. And if people internally start understanding these and the importance, then it will be much easier to engage with our external suppliers and partners.
Do you measure the effectiveness of those trainings? Because a lot of companies are doing trainings for their supply chains, for their own employees as well. But do they actually work? Do you see the progress?
Well, usually the KPI, so what success looks like for me, it's the number of questions we get after doing this type of trainings. So usually if you are, as in school, if you are not very concerned and aware, probably you'll not have questions. And people bring a lot of questions. They want to understand these topics. And obviously we need to make the path starting with the simple things and then moving to more complex. I think the discussion of bringing legislation very strongly usually moves people away, and it not engage people very much. We need to showcase that this will be relevant for them, and not only in the relationship with Fidelidade, but also in the relationship with the other clients they have. But usually I measure success in terms of the engagement that we have after the training, not necessarily in the training in itself. And obviously we have some suppliers that are more engaged than others, but firstly, we show them the importance, and then we'll move forward. And as Ron was saying, we may end up in a situation where we can't work with that company. But we feel that it's much more important to engage and to change the way they do things than to take them away of our supply chain. Not only because it's very difficult for us to do it, but mostly because it's the way to impact. Because if we take them away, they might be doing the same thing with other type of clients.
Yes, and it's also very important to work with the market in order to make it more responsible in terms of the human rights. And my second question to all the panelists actually now would be, maybe the microphone can stay with you. We can start from that side. You mentioned that the governments have very important role in setting the rules within the country context jurisdiction to protect the human rights. And different regulators also, Annabella talked a bit in the beginning about the new regulations in the EU market, the CSDDD, CSRD. How do those new regulations on the regional level, on the local level, affect your operations and supply chain responsibility in terms of the human rights? Do they help you to be more responsible in the supply chains in terms of the human rights? Or how is the implementation process going? Because it's quite new and many companies have challenges there as well.
Well, we are first focusing on CSRD because it's the first one we'll need to answer just next year. My team for 1 year is already working on that. Although we are obviously already looking to CSDDD, but we need to start somewhere. Our team is not 1,000 people. But our headquarters are in Portugal, and we are faced with the tougher regulations. So basically, we are not faced with a tougher regulation in any other of the countries that we are operating. So if we understand very well what is being asked in Europe, the difficulty is that we are majority stakeholders on all the operations we have. And they all face the regulation of Europe because we are based in Europe, so we need to make sure that in the other countries we can apply. Sometimes we have some challenges, that is the fact that some of the obligations that Europe imposes are even not possible in some of the jurisdictions because it's against the local law. So then sometimes we may end up in a situation that we don't know exactly how to operate, because in one hand we need to comply, in the other hand we can't locally. But mostly what we do in terms of the geographies we are in is very similar to what we do with the suppliers in Portugal. We need to firstly engage with the companies. We can't say, oh, we are from Europe, we know everything and you need to comply with what we are saying. We need to train them, and we are now also training all the employees in the world. We have 3,000 employees, 3,500 in Portugal, but 8,000 around the world. So firstly, training the internal teams, then explaining why this is important, engaging the compliance team, the procurement team, and trying to, let's say, test in Portugal and then export to the other geographies, because sometimes we are imposing things to them that we are even not able to do it still in Portugal. So we are trying to be as pragmatic as possible, and actually CSRD brings a topic that I think supports very well, not only this topic but generically ESG. There is a materiality concept. Yep. And so probably the answer is not making 10,000 questions to all the suppliers we have. We need to make sure that we do the right questions to the right suppliers. In some industries, there is no need, as the example I was giving. Does it make sense to make 100 questions in terms of child labor to an hospital? Probably it doesn't, because the probability of having a child working in an hospital, I would say that is probably zero or almost zero. So we need to take materiality on that concept, and that's what we are doing, is to move our questionnaire to a more risk-based, industry-specific questionnaire, so that we end up with less questions, less scrutiny, and that they can focus. Because if I am a supplier and I receive 1,000 questions, and even for ourselves to scrutinize all those questions will be
that would be
not
effective at all.
challenge.
Thank you so much for sharing this, Joao. Turning to you with the same question, and I would like to ask you to keep the responses to 2 minutes so that we are able to fit our conversation within the time limits that we have today. Yes, please.
Sure. So basically we are not a listed company, so in terms of CSRD or CSDDD, we still have some lead time. We are working on it. We have done our work in terms of integrated reporting already, but we still have some time to impose those regulations to us. But I'd say that we have been already impacted by other kinds of regulations which we have to apply to our projects. So we develop very large renewable energy projects, namely in Angola, as I spoke briefly about. We're talking about 500 million to 1 billion euro investments, and these investments, they are financed through export credit agencies. So what this means is European countries covering the risk of developing projects in the developing world. And financiers, obviously, they want their money back, but what they also want is to cover ESG risks. So they impose certain rules to project developers, and what we have to do is conduct environmental and social impact assessments in every project that we do. This involves not only doing these on site, but also looking at our supply chain. And one of the examples that I spoke briefly about in terms of the solar panel procurement process, what our financiers or the financiers of these projects say is that there are certain regions in the world, so just to give you a very brief data, 95% of solar panels are done with the use of polysilicon. 50% of polysilicon production worldwide is done in China, in a specific region, Xinjiang region, which is being monitored by the UN Human Rights Office, and it was actually alluded to in Annabella's presentation, which is the Uyghur people working in this region, which basically they are being monitored for forced labor. And what this means is a great challenge in terms of sourcing solar panels, which we can ensure that comply with human rights. So basically we source them from South Korea. So we have 2 suppliers from South Korea, namely Hanwha and Hyundai, where we source our panels, and we have to work with them to ensure that there is no polysilicon coming from this region in the world. So I perfectly understand João's point regarding trying to work with suppliers. For MCA, there are clearly some problems which are too large for us, MCA, to engage with, and so we just have to negatively screen these suppliers. So this is just one of the examples that I wanted to provide.
Thank you so much, João. Moving to Rodrigo, how does the standard setting, you said you work with the Sustainable Development Goals, helping your supply chain to align to the SDGs and contribute to the implementation of the SDGs. How the setting of this framework actually helped you in your work?
A lot, right? My job is directly related with SDGs. So all these standards that are appearing, we don't see a big push from our side because our business is covering all sectors in infrastructure and in construction. Many of these are already being addressed, from a positive side of things, right? There are negative sides and positive sides, as the video from Annabella showed, right? We can have a positive impact on human rights or a negative impact of human rights. Many of our solutions are indeed provided to support positive impact in many aspects, and I can bring you examples on that, and they are focused on SDGs for sure. For instance, the energy transition and providing energy. Energy transition is a very important aspect here, but when we talk about solar panels or offshore wind or any battery storage, so you need rare earth elements and critical minerals that can come, nickel, cobalt, lithium, all them. So cobalt is coming, like almost all cobalt comes from Congo, right? And they are still on poverty. So the mining there, it's not working very well for their poverty. But what we see is lots of environmental pollution aspects and health condition in these mines. And we are providing software to some of these companies like Rio Tinto and others that are leaders in the market that are using our software for responsible mining, so to reduce environmental impact, so they can better understand the impacts on the earth and water and try to control that exactly because of SDG framework as part of that. But then, that's just an example. But for instance, for water, we have several examples in the supply chain, for instance, for oil and gas. So for more than 40 years, for instance, there were companies exploring, trying to collect data in Tanzania and Somalia. They were trying to find oil, prospecting and collecting data for 40 years there. They never found oil, so they stopped sampling more. But then there was a company called Ruden AS that started using our software. They got all that data, and they integrated all that data, and with our software, they modeled the geotechnical. They created the geotechnical model of the underground, and they were able to find water, deep water, in more than 600 meters in there. And they are now providing water to 2 million people in Tanzania based on the data from the oil and gas 40 years ago, right? So only by that. So it's another aspect that can be used. The same in India, projects where they are trying to, they don't have, they have 2-3 hours of water supply per day, which creates a lot of problems on them. So they are creating, they are developing new water grids there using advanced systems with IoT, with sensors, with hydraulic model, and now they are controlling pressure and avoiding water loss, and they are providing 24/7 water. They are based on software and the infrastructure. So just to give some examples how you can use also technology to improve
The human
human
rights.
rights.
Thank you
Because
so much,
it's
Rodrigo.
water,
Very
it's health, and energy. Yeah.
excellent examples on how the technologies can contribute to the human rights protection and providing basic human rights to the local populations, which are in the vulnerable situations. And as DG providing the context for that. Maria, back to the CS Triple D and CSRD, how does that help you in your business?
Sure. So Bondalti will be obliged to align with CSRD starting 2025, like most of the companies. But we started our work of gap analysis and starting to align last year, and has been following. We started with the green taxonomy to identify which activities are aligned, including to have the safeguards for environmental and social issues. And we also developed our double materiality assessment last year, and this year already we reviewed it, aligned with the FRI guidelines. And one thing that was interesting to notice was that we had this topic, human rights, that wasn't considered material last year. And when we reviewed it this year with a lot of representatives from our main stakeholders, and this new topic emerged as a top material topic. And one thing that we concluded is that when these representatives were analyzing the IRO's impacts, risks, and opportunities, they clearly identified they were lacking visibility among the value chain, in the supply chain. And that brought back this topic as the most material, because, of course, if we consider our direct activities, our employees, since we are operating mainly in Europe, that kind of issues are generally controlled. But when we look at the supply chain, that's a different matter. So that's an interesting conclusion from the double materiality that help us to move forward with our strategy. But I would like to stress that not only regulation has been a pusher, but also the market demands. Because our clients demand more visibility, and they require more information from us directly and from our supply chain, not only environmental but also social information. So, for instance, Bondalti has been answering to the EcoVadis questionnaire for a lot of years. We are proud to have, for the fourth year consecutively, the platinum medal. And that's one example that provides the full spectrum of ESG topics and also human rights within the supply chain, not only our direct activities. That is a way that companies can demonstrate the evidence that is required to answer the questionnaire, that they are monitoring that kind of topics. So I believe that's one example. And considering CS Triple D, we are not obliged, since we have less than 1,000 employees, but we are already conducting all these mechanisms, like I said, the digital platform to screen the ESG risks among the supply chain, also the platform for the stakeholder engagement, training, capacity building, and also all the other mechanisms that we already have, like ethics, code of conduct for our suppliers, and all the mechanisms like auditing, like I said previously. All of those frameworks will be aligned with CS Triple D. So when it comes to us, because probably after 2027, other sectors will be obliged to answer, we think we will be already prepared for that.
Thank you so much, Maria. Very interesting examples, and also very specific example on how the standards actually helped you to identify the human rights impacts that you were not really thinking of before. So from all the examples that you have provided, the regulations and standards, of course, they're very good to actually mitigate the human rights violations in your supply chain. But at the same time, there are other factors as well, such as market demand and the local context that you operate in, that help you to push the human rights protection. So that was a very interesting discussion. I don't know how much, yes, we don't really have much time left, but can we have just like a one sentence from all of the speakers? So I just wanted to ask you, what should be the takeaway from this panel discussion? Like, what do you want the audience to remember from this discussion when they leave? Just one sentence. Maria, we can start with you.
Well, I thought of 5 topics. I'll try to resume it in a sentence. So firstly, don't focus only on tier 1, go further, tier 2, tier 3. Don't rely only on documental evidence or remote interviews, go there, see it by yourself. Also concerning workforce within your sites or installations, work closely with people directly on the field and maintain human relationships because issues will arise from that. Set specific targets and KPIs to monitor with your suppliers, but with realistic action plans. So at the same time to maintaining these sustainable relationships and avoiding them to disappear in the market because some of them are really dependent. And finally, invest in training and capacity building and sharing experience, because when we are investing in our supply chain, we are making our own value chain in our own organization more resilient.
Thank you so much, Maria. Rodrigo.
Okay, so for me, I think what I want people to retain is the fact that I believe technology, digital solutions, digital twins, AI, they already contribute a lot in terms of positive impacts for human rights. But the potential is also very, it's amazing. We cannot even imagine the positive aspects that we can have. There are also risks there, and we cannot forget that. We need to manage that as well. And the message I want to say, and it's what we take in our company, we need to control some of these risks in the supply chain. So what we can control is what we call the responsible AI is really important. So we only use AI when we feel there's really a positive impact in the final result, right? So we don't do it for fun. We do it because, not because we can, but because we see the evidence of the positive impact, right? And I want people to retain this. We should only apply AI, and even for our lives. If you don't need to use AI and generative AI, don't use it. Just use it if you really feel the impact of it.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. Joao?
I wanted to finish off with a positive note, so I'll briefly describe one of our flagship social responsibility projects, which involves supply chain.
Briefly.
Involves circular economy. So basically, it's using the wooden pallets that are being shipped to ensure the integrity of solar panels all the way from South Korea. They are dismantled when they get to Angola. We train carpenters, local carpenters, to use those wooden pallets to make furniture, and then we use that furniture to donate to hospitals and to local schools. So that's a way of integrating the whole supply chain into a positive impact in local communities.
Thank you so much, Joao.
So I would end just saying that we need to be pragmatic, because if not, at least for sustainability division, it's an endless job and we'll be very frustrated. So be pragmatic, try to solve the key questions and based on materiality, and make sure that internally the company understands the importance of this beyond regulation. Because if it's only regulation, people usually are not very moved for that, but they are if you understand the end goal of the regulation. So usually I try not to talk a lot about regulation, try to explain why is this important.
Very important recommendation. Thank you all for insightful conversations. I'm sure that we have all learned a lot from your experience, and I wish you a success in your future endeavors. And thank you once again to the UN Global Compact Network Portugal for this very important discussion. Let's give a round of applause to our speakers.